Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we wander into the long and layered story of the fall of Rome. It was not a sudden fall, but a long and gradual fading of something that once seemed unbreakable. An empire that stretched across continents, that shaped laws, language, and daily life, and that seemed destined to endure beyond memory. And yet, it changed. Power shifted. Borders softened. Old certainties gave way to new realities. Cities that once stood at the center of the world found themselves drifting toward the edges of something unfamiliar. Leaders rose and fell. Armies marched, sometimes for Rome, sometimes against it. And through it all, people adapted, endured, and carried pieces of Rome forward into a changing world. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. So for now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Allow the day to fade into the background as your thoughts begin to drift. And as your mind begins to soften, we will trace the quiet transformation of an empire that never truly vanished. Let's begin. Rome was not destroyed in a day, but unraveled for centuries. What makes this story so gripping is that there was no single crack, no single battle, and no single villain. Rome's collapse was a long surrender of strength that began while its temples still stood, its laws still ruled, and its emperors still issued commands. For generations, the empire absorbed shock after shock. There were border wars, economic strain, political murders, and provinces that grew harder to control. Each crisis was survived, yet each survival left Rome a little less secure than before. That is part of the wonder of it. People living through the change often did not know they were watching a world come apart. A merchant, a farmer, or a soldier might still see Roman roads, Roman coins, and Roman officials, even as the deeper machinery was failing. The fall of Rome is fascinating because it was not an ending that announced itself. It was an age slowly learning it could end. The Western Empire fell, while the Eastern Empire survived for another 1,000 years. That contrast is one of the great surprises of history. When people speak of Rome falling, they often picture the whole Roman world vanishing into darkness. But that is not what happened. The Western half lost its emperors, its provinces, and its ability to command obedience. The Eastern half kept going, with armies, laws, cities, taxes, and a powerful capital at Constantinople. It preserved Roman government so successfully that its people still called themselves Romans centuries later. This changes the whole story. Rome did not simply disappear. It divided into unequal futures. In the West, power broke into separate kingdoms. In the East, imperial rule endured through invasions, court intrigues, and religious conflict. One side fragmented, the other adapted. That makes the fall of Rome feel less like a sudden death and more like a dramatic split in the destiny of a civilization. The empire survived, just not everywhere, and not in the same form. A teenage emperor watched the Western Roman Empire quietly disappear. The image is astonishing. At the end of one of history's greatest empires stood not a towering conqueror or a legendary statesman, but a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Even his name feels almost unreal, since it echoed both Rome's mythical founder and Augustus, its first emperor. Yet the world he inherited was already slipping away. Real power had long since passed into the hands of generals, commanders, and political brokers who raised emperors as easily as they dismissed them. When Odoacer removed him from the throne in 476, there was no final blaze of imperial glory. There was no grand last stand that saved the Western crown. The emperor was simply deposed, and the imperial insignia was sent east. That is one reason this moment feels so haunting. A vast tradition ended not with the thunder people expect from legend, but with a boy at the center of a system too hollow to defend itself. Rome was invaded and stripped of its riches more than once, astonishing a world that believed it could never fall. For centuries, Rome had been more than a city. It was an idea of permanence. Even people far from Italy imagined it as the fixed center of order, prestige, and civilization. That is why the sacks of Rome carried such emotional force. When Alaric's Goths entered the city in 410, the news rippled across the Mediterranean like a spiritual disaster. Later, when the Vandals sacked it again in 455, the wound deepened. These attacks mattered not only for the treasure taken or the fear they caused in the streets. They mattered because they shattered confidence in Rome's untouchable status. A city that once inspired awe now inspired disbelief. Writers, bishops, and nobles struggled to process what had happened. If Rome could be violated, what could still feel secure? The fascination lies in that psychological collapse. Long before power fully vanished, the spell of invincibility had already been broken in public view. The empire that conquered the Mediterranean could no longer govern itself. This is one of the deepest ironies in history. Rome built an enormous realm through discipline, administration, and military force. It mastered coasts, rivers, trade routes, and peoples across 3 continents. Yet the very scale of that success became part of the later problem. Distant frontiers demanded armies. Armies demanded taxes. Taxes demanded a bureaucracy that reached into every province. As pressure mounted, the system became harder to coordinate and more expensive to maintain. Communication was slow. Regional crises multiplied. Ambitious commanders turned provincial strength into personal power. Local needs and central orders drifted apart. An empire designed to control others found it increasingly difficult to command itself. That makes the fall of Rome feel larger than a tale of invasion. It becomes a warning about power stretched too far. Expansion created magnificence, but it also created fragility. What once made Rome formidable eventually made it cumbersome, divided, and vulnerable to shocks it could no longer manage with confidence. Barbarian kings first served Rome before they carved it apart. That reversal makes the story feel far more complex than a simple clash between civilization and outsiders. Many of the men who later led kingdoms inside former Roman lands had learned Roman ways up close. They fought in Roman armies, negotiated with Roman officials, and sought Roman titles, pay, and prestige. Some groups entered imperial service as allies. Others were settled within the empire under agreements that were meant to turn potential enemies into useful partners. Rome had long relied on this kind of arrangement. It could absorb newcomers, use their soldiers, and bind them to imperial interests. But when leadership faltered, trust broke, and rewards failed to arrive, those same relationships became dangerous. Men trained by Rome knew where its weaknesses lay and how its political world worked. The wonder of this fact is, but the Western Empire was not merely attacked from beyond its borders. It was partly dismantled by figures who had once operated within the Roman system itself. The fall of Rome began long before the city itself fell. That is what makes the story feel so immense. If you looked only at the city of Rome, you might imagine the drama beginning when enemies approached its walls. In truth, the deeper changes had started much earlier and often far away. Power had already shifted toward other capitals. Provinces had begun slipping from reliable control. Armies were becoming harder to supply and harder to trust. Political instability had turned the throne into a prize fought over by rivals. None of this required the city itself to collapse first. In fact, Rome remained a symbol long after it stopped being the true center of imperial decision-making. That delay between appearance and reality is part of what gives the subject its power. A civilization can still look majestic while its foundations are weakening. Marble, ceremony, and memory can outlast strength. By the time the city's fate became dramatic, much of the real unraveling had already been underway for generations. Civil war weakened Rome almost as much as foreign invasion. It is tempting to picture Rome as a victim of forces gathering beyond its frontiers. Yet again and again, some of the worst damage came from Romans fighting Romans. Generals marched on their own state. Rival claimants fought for the throne. Soldiers pledged loyalty to commanders who offered reward, survival, or prestige. Whole armies that might have guarded the borders were instead drawn into internal struggles over succession and legitimacy. These conflicts drained money, destroyed trust, and turned politics into a battlefield. They also sent a dangerous message to outside groups. An empire divided against itself could be pressured, bargained with, or entered at moments of weakness. Civil war did not merely distract Rome from external threats. It trained the empire to injure itself. That is one reason the fall feels so tragic. Rome was not only battered by enemies at the gate. It was repeatedly hollowed from within by contests for power, until the state grew too fractured to respond with the old authority. Roman roads once spread power, then carried enemies to its heart. Few things capture Rome's genius more vividly than its roads. They stitched together provinces, moved armies with remarkable speed, connected cities to markets, and made imperial rule feel physically present across enormous distances. A command issued at the center could travel outward along these routes, followed by officials, merchants, tax collectors, and troops. The roads were part of the magic of Roman order. But in a bitter twist, the same network later worked against the empire. Once hostile forces crossed a frontier or entered as federates beyond firm control, they could use those routes too. Roads that had once projected Roman confidence now gave invaders efficient paths through imperial territory. The system remained impressive, but it no longer belonged securely to Rome alone. That reversal is unforgettable because it shows how tools of greatness can become channels of danger. The empire's infrastructure did not vanish when Rome weakened. It endured long enough to help carry the crisis deep into Roman lands. Even after Rome fell, people still called themselves Roman for centuries. That may be the most haunting fact of all. Empires can lose territory, emperors, and armies, yet identity can survive much longer than institutions. In many places, Roman law, language, customs, and memory remained part of daily life long after the Western imperial throne disappeared. Elites still prized Roman education. Clergy used Latin. Former imperial subjects did not instantly wake up feeling that they belonged to a brand new civilization. In the East, this continuity was even stronger, since the empire based in Constantinople continued to exist and openly claimed the Roman name. But the idea reached beyond that. New rulers in the West often borrowed Roman titles, Roman habits, and Roman forms of administration, because Roman legitimacy still carried immense weight. That is what makes the fall of Rome so compelling. It was not a clean break between one world and another. It was an ending that kept living on inside the people, institutions, and ambitions that followed. Diocletian split imperial rule because one emperor could no longer manage everything. By the late 3rd century, the Roman world had grown too difficult for one pair of hands. Frontiers stretched from Britain to the Near East. Usurpers could rise in one region while invaders pressed in another. News traveled slowly, and an emperor who rushed west might leave the east exposed. Diocletian answered this with something bold. He reorganized rule so the empire could be governed by multiple emperors at once, each responsible for a different zone. This was not a sign of confidence. It was a clear admission that the old model no longer worked. The solution brought order for a time, and it helped the empire recover from chaos. Yet it also changed the Roman imagination. Power was no longer instinctively centered in one man and one place. Once imperial rule became divided in practice, it was easier for the Roman world itself to feel divided in destiny, ambition, and identity. Constantine built a new capital that quietly pulled power eastward. When Constantine founded Constantinople, he did far more than adorn an old Greek city with palaces, forums, and churches. He created a new center of gravity for the Roman world. Its position was brilliant. It sat close to the wealthy eastern provinces, close to key frontiers, and close to the trade routes that linked Europe and Asia. From there, an emperor could respond more effectively to major threats than from old Rome in Italy. The city was easier to defend, richer in opportunity, and better placed for command. Over time, that mattered enormously. Wealth, attention, and imperial energy drifted toward the east, where the state had stronger cities and deeper resources. Rome kept its ancient prestige, but prestige is not the same as power. This shift did not destroy the West by itself, yet it changed the balance of the empire. One new capital slowly redrew the map of Roman importance without needing to announce it. Rome stopped being the political center before it stopped being symbolic. This is one of the strangest turns in the story. Rome remained the city of emperors in imagination, memory, and prestige, even after emperors no longer depended on it as the true seat of command. Decisions that shaped the empire were increasingly made elsewhere. Armies were directed from frontier-facing courts. Administrators worked in cities better placed for communication and defense. Yet the old capital still carried a weight no other place could match. Its monuments spoke of conquest. Its senate recalled ancient republican dignity. Its name itself still suggested world rule. That gap between symbolism and reality is what makes the moment so fascinating. A city can keep its aura long after it loses practical control. People continued to look toward Rome as a source of legitimacy, even while government had moved on. The empire became, in a sense, politically decentralized, while remaining emotionally tied to a place that no longer directed its daily survival. Emperors increasingly ruled from Milan, Ravenna, and far from Rome. That change tells you exactly where Rome's rulers felt the real pressure. Milan was closer to the northern frontiers where trouble often flared. Ravenna, surrounded by marshes and protected by strong defenses, offered safety in an age when security mattered more than ceremony. These were not glamorous replacements for the old capital. They were practical choices made by a government under strain. An emperor who stayed in Rome might bask in history, but he would be farther from the armies and crisis points that demanded immediate attention. So the court moved where survival required it. That had consequences far beyond geography. When rulers no longer lived amid Rome's old political class and monuments, the emotional bond between emperor and city weakened. The Western state became more mobile, more defensive, and more detached from its ancient center. A government that rules from safer ground may endure longer, but it also begins to admit that the old heart of empire is no longer secure enough. The empire became too vast for one court, one army, and one will. What had once looked like Rome's greatest triumph began to reveal its darker side. Governing a realm of such size demanded coordination on a breathtaking scale. There were deserts, mountains, sea lanes, great rivers, and distant fortresses, all tied to one imperial system that needed constant money, manpower, and obedience. A single court could not see every danger clearly. A single army could not be everywhere at once. A single ruler could not easily impose one consistent purpose across regions with different pressures and priorities. That strain invited improvisation, and improvisation invited fragmentation. Local commanders gained influence because they were present when danger struck. Regional elites learned to think in narrower terms when central support seemed uncertain. The empire remained one on parchment and in ceremony, yet in practice it was pulled in many directions at once. Great size had given Rome its glory. Great size also made every weakness harder to hide and every emergency harder to master. Frontier armies often made emperors, then destroyed them just as quickly. Along Rome's borders stood the legions that guarded the empire, but those same troops also became kingmakers. A successful commander on the frontier could be proclaimed emperor by soldiers who trusted his leadership more than the distant court. Once that happened, the empire was dragged into a new struggle. Rival armies declared rival emperors. Marches began. Battles followed. Whoever won might sit on the throne, yet the process itself did terrible damage. The borders were weakened while troops fought each other. Provinces were taxed and stripped for civil war. And the new emperor soon faced the same danger from the next ambitious general. This made Roman rule feel unstable in a very intimate way. The men meant to defend the state became the force that repeatedly disrupted its continuity. In times of danger, soldiers wanted strong leaders close at hand. In doing so, they helped create a system where military loyalty could elevate a ruler in one season and destroy him in the next. 3rd century chaos nearly shattered the empire long before its final collapse. Long before the Western Empire disappeared, Rome went through a terrifying age when collapse already seemed possible. During the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell with astonishing speed. Invasions struck multiple frontiers. Plague and economic stress deepened the pressure. At one point, the empire even splintered into separate political units, with breakaway regimes in the west and east. For a time, Rome looked less like a unified superpower and more like a state coming apart under simultaneous blows. That it survived it all is remarkable. Strong rulers restored order, defeated rivals, and stitched the empire back together. But survival came at a price. The state that emerged was harder, more militarized, more bureaucratic, and more openly dependent on forceful control. The old world had been saved, yet it had also been transformed. That is why this period matters so much. The final fall was not the first time Romans feared the end. They had already stared into that abyss once before. Rome survived one crisis only to inherit deeper weaknesses afterward. Again and again, the empire managed to pull back from disaster. A strong emperor restored order. A border was stabilized. A rebellion was crushed. A reform bought time. From a distance, these recoveries can look like proof that Rome remained resilient. In one sense, it did. But many of those victories came with costs that made later problems harder to solve. Emergency taxation could burden whole populations. Expanded bureaucracy could become cumbersome. Greater reliance on military strongmen could protect the state for a moment, then empower dangerous figures later. Settlements made under pressure could calm one frontier while planting future instability in another. That pattern gives the story its haunting rhythm. Rome kept surviving, yet each survival altered the empire's character and narrowed its room for error. Recovery did not always mean restoration. Sometimes it meant adaptation under duress. The empire moved forward carrying scars from every crisis, and those scars slowly changed what Rome was capable of enduring next. Short-lived emperors turned the throne into the empire's most dangerous prize. The Roman throne became so coveted and so unstable that it began to poison the state around it. In healthier times, the office of emperor could project continuity and command. In troubled times, it became the focus of constant plotting, military ambition, and desperate succession struggles. When rulers died quickly, whether by battle, murder, or coup, the office lost its ability to reassure the empire. Every accession invited a contest. Every contest encouraged men with troops to gamble for supreme power. The throne promised unmatched authority, wealth, and prestige, but it also drew violence toward itself like a magnet. This made the center of Roman government profoundly dangerous. Instead of calming rivalry, the imperial office often intensified it. That is a striking paradox. The position designed to hold the empire together became one of the chief engines of instability. Rome did not merely suffer from weak emperors. It suffered from a system in which becoming emperor could tempt ambitious men to break the state. Loyalty shifted from the state to ambitious generals with private armies. As central authority weakened, personal bonds became more powerful than abstract loyalty to Rome. Soldiers depended on generals for pay, protection, promotion, and plunder. Provincial elites depended on strong commanders for security. In that world, allegiance could begin to flow toward a person rather than an institution. A general who won battles and rewarded followers might inspire fierce devotion, even if his interests clashed with the wider needs of the empire. This was dangerous because Rome had long relied on the idea that armies ultimately served the state. Once that assumption weakened, power became more personal and more precarious. Commanders could bargain with emperors, threaten them, or replace them. Troops might follow the man they trusted rather than the ruler they were supposed to obey. The result was a Roman world full of armed reputations competing inside the shell of imperial government. That shift did not destroy Rome overnight, but it made every crisis riskier because force was no longer tied securely to a stable center. Inflation hollowed Roman money until coins carried more promise than silver. There is something startling about an empire losing trust in the very money stamped with its rulers' faces. For centuries, Roman coins had helped bind together markets, taxes, wages, and military pay across an enormous world. But as pressures mounted, the silver content of many coins was reduced again and again. What still looked official in the hand began to matter less in actual worth. Prices rose, confidence slipped. People became more cautious about what they accepted and what they hoarded. A coin could still bear imperial authority, yet contain far less real value than it once had. That gap between appearance and substance is one of the great themes of Rome's decline. The state needed resources urgently, but by stretching the currency, it made ordinary exchange less reliable. When trust weakens in money, daily life becomes harder to predict, and even a mighty empire starts to feel strangely fragile at the level of the marketplace. Crushing taxes fell harder as the empire grew poorer and weaker. As Rome struggled to defend itself, govern its provinces, and fund its armies, the need for revenue did not shrink. In many ways, it grew more urgent. Yet the population that had to bear those demands was often less able to do so than before. That created a grim cycle. When productivity faltered and regions became unstable, tax pressure could feel even heavier because fewer people were left to carry the burden. Officials still had quotas to meet. Communities still had obligations to fulfill. For farmers, traders, and local elites, this could turn imperial rule into something less protective and more exhausting. The tragedy is that the state was not taxing because it was strong. It was taxing because it was desperate. And desperation can be harsh. A government under strain may squeeze harder precisely when its people can least endure it. That kind of pressure does not just drain wealth. It erodes loyalty and makes the empire feel like a weight. Peasants fled obligations that bound them to land, labor, and debt. For many ordinary people, the late empire was not only a story of armies and emperors, it was a story of being trapped. Rural workers could face taxes, labor demands, and debts that tied them ever more tightly to the land they worked. Mobility became harder. Obligation became more permanent. In some places, people responded in the most human way possible. They tried to escape. They fled estates, abandoned villages, or sought the protection of powerful patrons who could shield them from the full reach of officials. This matters because it reveals a quieter form of breakdown. When peasants start disappearing from the system, the state loses more than labor. It loses visibility, control, and dependable revenue. The countryside begins to slip from neat administration into a world of evasion and local survival. That shift is fascinating because it shows Rome not from a throne room, but from the ground beneath it, where ordinary people were already loosening themselves from imperial grip. Trade faltered as insecurity spread across roads, rivers, and frontiers. Rome had flourished through movement. Grain crossed seas. Oil and wine traveled in bulk. Pottery, cloth, metal goods, and luxury items moved through routes that linked distant provinces into one economic world. When that system worked, it made the empire feel almost miraculous in scale. But commerce depends on confidence. Merchants need roads that are passable, rivers that are navigable, ports that are functioning, and territories where theft, war, or sudden disruption do not destroy the journey. As instability spread, that confidence became harder to maintain. A route that was profitable in one decade could become dangerous in the next. Border trouble could interrupt supply. Local warfare could cut connections between city and countryside. Trade did not vanish all at once, but it became less smooth, less predictable, and less far-reaching in some regions. That matters because an empire is held together not only by armies, but by circulation. When movement becomes uncertain, even distant communities begin to feel the strain. Cities shrank when imperial protection and prosperity slowly faded away. In the high days of Roman power, cities were among its proudest achievements. They offered baths, markets, theaters, forums, workshops, and monumental buildings that proclaimed order and civic life. To live in a Roman city was to feel part of a wider world connected by law, culture, and exchange. But urban life depends on support. It needs trade, tax income, administration, and the confidence that prosperity will continue. As those supports weakened, many cities changed. Public buildings fell into disrepair. Defensive walls became more important than open civic splendor. Populations contracted. In some places, people clustered into smaller, more defensible spaces within older urban footprints. The city did not always vanish, yet it became something leaner and more anxious than before. This is one of the most evocative signs of Rome's decline, because it is visible in stone. Magnificent urban worlds did not simply die. They narrowed, adapted, and settled into a harsher reality than the one they were built for. The army consumed vast resources Rome could no longer easily provide. An empire of Rome's size could not survive without soldiers. Garrisons had to be maintained. Frontiers had to be watched. Fortifications had to be supplied. Horses, weapons, food, transport, and pay all demanded constant investment. For a long time, Rome managed this astonishing burden. But as crises multiplied, the military need became heavier, just as the empire's means grew more strained. That created a relentless tension. The state needed a strong army to protect its provinces and deter enemies. Yet sustaining that strength required a flow of wealth that was becoming harder to gather. The military machine did not simply exist in the background. It dominated the empire's priorities. Decisions about taxation, administration, and policy were shaped by the urgent need to keep troops in the field. That is part of the drama here. Rome was not ruined because it cared too little about defense. In many ways, it was stretched thin because defense had become such a consuming necessity. Recruiting citizens grew harder, so emperors leaned more on outsiders. At its height, Rome had drawn enormous strength from the willingness of its people to serve. Military life brought danger, but also pay, status, and a path into the imperial system. Over time, that bond became less reliable. Service could feel more burdensome, less rewarding, and less appealing than before. Demographic strain, social change, and economic pressure all made recruitment more difficult. Emperors still needed men, so they increasingly turned to non-Roman groups for manpower. Some entered as allied contingents. Some were settled under agreements that required military service. Others were hired because the state had few better options. This did not mean outsiders were automatically disloyal or ineffective. Many fought well and became essential to imperial defense, but the shift changed the character of Roman military power. The army was no longer drawing its strength in the same way from the citizen body. That made the empire's survival depend more heavily on relationships it could not always control. Mercenaries defended Rome, but their loyalty could shift with power. There is a deep tension in trusting armed strangers to preserve a state already under pressure. Rome often employed soldiers whose primary attachment was not to Roman identity, tradition, or civic memory, but to commanders, contracts, and immediate reward. In a stable system, that could still work. Payment and prestige could secure service. In an unstable system, the danger was obvious. If a rival offered better terms, if an emperor failed to deliver, or if the balance of power changed suddenly, loyalty could become negotiable. This did not mean such troops were uniquely unreliable. Roman politics itself was often unreliable. That is part of the problem. Mercenary service flourished in a world where force had become transactional and survival demanded practical choices. The fascinating thing is that Rome kept using these arrangements because it had to. The empire needed soldiers now, even if the long-term cost was uncertainty. In moments of crisis, necessity can create solutions that carry their own future threat inside them. Gold still glittered at court while daily life frayed in the provinces. One of the most haunting features of Rome's decline is the contrast between splendor at the center and strain at the edges. Imperial courts could still stage ceremony, display rich garments, distribute honors, and project an image of magnificence. Visitors might see precious metal, intricate ritual, and all the visual language of supreme authority. Yet beyond that brilliance, provincial life could tell a harsher story. Local communities faced insecurity, heavier burdens, decaying infrastructure, and a thinner imperial presence than before. That contrast matters because it reminds us that decline is rarely uniform. An empire can still look impressive from the palace while becoming less dependable in ordinary places. The symbols of greatness may remain polished even as practical control grows patchy. This gives the story much of its eerie power. Rome did not become poor everywhere at once. In some places, grandeur survived beside deterioration, creating a world where appearance and experience no longer matched in the way they once had. The empire's bureaucracy grew heavier as its ability to enforce shrank. When a state comes under pressure, it often responds by creating more rules, more offices, and more layers of supervision. Rome did exactly that. Administrators tracked taxes, supplies, legal duties, and military needs with increasing intensity. On paper, this could look like a more organized empire. In practice, it could feel cumbersome, demanding, and uneven. A growing bureaucracy does not always mean growing strength. Sometimes it means the state is working harder to hold on to what once came more easily. That is what makes this development so revealing. The machinery of government became denser, yet its reach could still falter where roads were unsafe, local magnates were powerful, or frontier regions were unstable. Orders might be issued with great formality and still fail to shape events on the ground. The late empire becomes fascinating here because it feels so recognizably human. Institutions multiply in response to weakness, but multiplication itself cannot guarantee control when the world underneath is slipping. Germanic peoples were not one nation, but many different worlds. It is easy to imagine Rome facing one vast barbarian mass pressing at its edges, but the truth was far more intricate and far more fascinating. The peoples beyond and within the frontiers were divided by language, custom, leadership, and ambition. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Suebi, Burgundians, and many others did not move as one people with one common plan. Some fought Rome. Some traded with it. Some entered its service. Some copied Roman habits, while others guarded their own traditions. Even within larger groups, loyalties could splinter between rival leaders and separate bands. That matters because it makes the fall of Rome feel less like a simple invasion and more like a shifting human mosaic. Roman officials had to negotiate with many different communities, each with its own fears and opportunities. The empire did not face a single enemy civilization. It faced a constantly changing frontier world, full of competing peoples who could become partners, rivals, settlers, or conquerors depending on the moment. Rome often absorbed newcomers before fear turned them into enemies. One of Rome's greatest talents was its ability to take outsiders and draw them into its own system. Across centuries, the empire had welcomed migrants, recruited foreign soldiers, granted privileges to allied leaders, and settled new populations on imperial land. This was not always an act of generosity. It was often practical statecraft. Rome knew how to turn strangers into taxpayers, soldiers, and subjects. A frontier people could become a useful buffer. A foreign leader could become a Roman officer. A newcomer could begin as an outsider and end as part of the imperial world. That is what makes later breakdown so compelling. The problem was not that Rome had never dealt with migration before. The problem was that the old machinery of absorption began to fail under greater pressure. When fear, corruption, and mistrust replaced skillful management, a process that had once strengthened the empire could instead produce anger, rebellion, and permanent fracture, where integration might once have succeeded. The Goths entered the empire first as refugees, not conquerors. That simple truth transforms the whole story. In the late 4th century, large Gothic groups approached the Danube not as triumphant invaders seeking Roman treasure, but as frightened people seeking safety. Behind them loomed the Huns, whose sudden violence had shattered the balance of lands beyond the frontier. The Goths looked to Rome, not at first as an enemy to be destroyed, but as the only great power capable of offering shelter. They asked to cross into imperial territory and live under Roman authority. Imagine the drama of that moment. A mighty empire stood at the riverbank, and on the other side were entire communities carrying fear, hope, and desperation. Rome agreed to admit them, at least in principle. That decision could have changed history in one direction or another. Managed well, it might have created loyal new subjects. Managed badly, it would unleash one of the most dangerous crises the late empire had ever faced. Roman mistreatment helped turn desperate migrants into a devastating revolt. The tragedy deepens when you see what happened after the Goths were allowed across the Danube. Instead of receiving organized care and stable settlement, many were met by greed, confusion, and abuse. Roman officials exploited their hunger. Supplies were mishandled. Families who had crossed in fear found themselves starving inside the empire that had promised protection. Ancient sources describe horrors that still shock the imagination, including parents driven to trade their children for food. Whether every detail was exactly as reported, the larger truth is clear. A humanitarian emergency was treated as an opportunity for profit. Under those conditions, trust had little chance of surviving. People who might have become loyal settlers were instead pushed toward fury and resistance. This is one of the most gripping turns in the fall of Rome, because it was not fate alone that created disaster. Human cruelty and incompetence helped transform vulnerable newcomers into enemies whose revolt would shake the empire to its core. The Battle of Adrianople destroyed an emperor and a Roman illusion. In the year 378, near Adrianople, the Roman Emperor Valens marched out to face Gothic forces in a battle he expected to control. What followed became one of the most devastating military disasters in Roman history. The army was exhausted, coordination broke down, and the fighting turned catastrophic. Valens himself was killed, though the exact manner of his death remains uncertain. Some said he fell on the field. Others believed he died in a farmhouse set ablaze. However it ended, the symbolism was immense. A reigning emperor had been destroyed by a force that Rome had recently admitted across its own frontier. That alone was staggering. Yet the deeper shock lay in what the battle revealed. Rome could still win great victories, but it could no longer assume that imperial power guaranteed command of every crisis. Adrianople shattered the comforting belief that the empire's military system would always impose order when it truly mattered. After Adrianople, Rome could no longer assume its armies would always prevail. The Roman army had long carried an aura that reached beyond tactics and weaponry. It represented discipline, inevitability, and the belief that organized imperial force would ultimately restore control. Adrianople damaged that confidence in a way that numbers alone cannot explain. Defeat on the battlefield was one thing. Defeat that exposed real vulnerability at the highest level of imperial war-making was another. The empire now had to reckon with the possibility that major field armies could be broken. Emperors could misjudge rapidly moving threats, and enemies inside the imperial world could not always be crushed on demand. That changed calculations everywhere. Allies, rivals, frontier peoples, and Roman decision-makers all had to think differently after such a shock. The battle did not instantly doom the empire, but it narrowed the margin for confidence. The Roman military remained formidable, yet it no longer stood above history with the same unquestioned aura of mastery it had once projected. Gothic cavalry exposed weaknesses in Roman tactics, command, and confidence. Part of what made Adrianople so alarming was the sudden force with which Gothic mounted warriors entered the battle and helped turn the day against Rome. Roman commanders had not fully controlled the pace of events. Units were drawn in unevenly. Coordination suffered. Then mobile cavalry struck with devastating effect, exploiting disorder at exactly the wrong moment for the imperial side. This was not simply a matter of one army losing to another. It was a vivid demonstration that Rome's commanders could misread a battlefield and pay an immense price for it. The empire had long prided itself on training, structure, and control. Here, those strengths failed under pressure. The image is unforgettable. An army that represented imperial order was thrown into confusion by speed, timing, and tactical collapse. That kind of defeat lives in memory because it feels so sudden. Confidence built over generations can be shaken in a single afternoon when command falters and the enemy sees the opening first. A refugee crisis on the Danube became a turning point in history. Some turning points begin with a coronation or a famous battle. This one began at a river crossing, with frightened people asking to be let in. That is part of what makes it so extraordinary. The Danube frontier became the stage for a decision that mixed humanitarian need, imperial policy, fear, and opportunity. Roman leaders had to choose how to respond to mass displacement on a scale that strained their institutions. They chose admission, but without the planning, honesty, and capacity needed to make it work. What followed was not a small local disturbance. It became a chain of events that led to revolt, battlefield disaster, and a lasting transformation in the balance between Rome and the peoples moving through its world. This moment feels hauntingly modern because it shows how migration, state weakness, and official failure can collide with enormous consequences. History did not pivot only in throne rooms. Sometimes it pivoted where a frontier system met human desperation and could not cope. Rome's borders failed not only from attack, but from mismanagement. Frontiers are often imagined as lines that stand or break under military force alone. Yet Rome's experience was far more complicated. A border could fail through bad decisions long before an enemy stormed through it. Officials could miscount arrivals, mishandle supplies, enrich themselves, delay action, or let confusion spread until control dissolved from within. That is exactly what makes the Danube crisis so revealing. The empire was not simply overwhelmed by irresistible violence. It also stumbled through corruption, poor coordination, and inadequate planning. The frontier system depended on administration as much as walls and weapons. It needed accurate records, fair distribution, capable officers, and timely command. When those things weakened, the border became porous in a deeper sense. Rome still had soldiers. Rome still had authority. But authority badly used can fail as surely as a broken fortification. This is one of the most human lessons in the fall of Rome. Empires can be undone by their own incompetence as much as by enemy strength. Entire peoples crossed into imperial lands seeking safety from the Huns. The arrival of the Huns sent tremors through the world beyond Rome's frontiers. Their sudden expansion did not merely create one new enemy. It destabilized a vast zone of peoples who now had to choose between submission, flight, resistance, or movement toward Roman territory. This is what gives the period such scale. Rome was not dealing with isolated raiders or small bands alone. It was confronting the movement of whole communities, with leaders, families, wagons, animals, and collective memory. These were not quick military incursions that ended with one campaign season. There were population shifts born from fear and upheaval farther east. Once such movements began, Rome could not treat them like ordinary border incidents. The empire faced a human tide shaped by forces beyond its direct control. That is why this phase of the story feels so immense. A distant power changed the map of pressure around Rome, and the effects rolled westward in living waves. The Huns did not conquer Rome, but they terrified Europe into motion. The Huns are fascinating because their greatest impact on Rome was not simple conquest. It was shock. Their arrival sent fear racing across the lands beyond the imperial frontier, and fear can move history almost as powerfully as armies. Communities that had lived in fragile balance suddenly faced a new kind of danger, one that seemed fast, unfamiliar, and hard to resist. Some fought. Some submitted. Many moved. That movement mattered enormously, because it pushed pressure outward in widening circles until Rome felt the consequences. The empire did not face the Huns only as opponents on a battlefield. It faced the human upheaval their advance created far beyond Roman control. That is what gives them such a strange and haunting role in the fall of the West. They were like a force off stage that still changed every scene. By frightening others into motion, they helped turn the Roman frontier into a zone of cascading instability and permanent transformation. Attila's shadow destabilized kingdoms, alliances, and the Roman frontier alike. Attila became one of the most feared names in late Roman history, not only because of what he attacked, but because of what his presence unsettled. Rulers had to calculate around him. Neighboring peoples had to decide whether to join him, resist him, bribe him, or flee his reach. Roman diplomats bargained under pressure. Frontier politics became more brittle because every alliance carried the question of how long it could survive beneath that looming threat. Even before armies met, uncertainty was already doing damage. Fear can loosen bonds that once seemed solid, and Attila's reputation carried that power across a vast region. He forced leaders to act defensively, urgently, and often imperfectly. Kingdoms could be shaken without being destroyed. Roman plans could be distorted before a battle even began. That is part of his fascination. He cast such a large political shadow that his influence spread far beyond the immediate path of his campaigns, reshaping choices all around the Roman world. Fear of the Huns pushed other groups deeper into Roman territory. One of the most dramatic features of this age is that Rome often faced people who were themselves running from danger. The Huns did not simply threaten the empire directly. They helped drive others toward it. Communities that might once have remained beyond the frontier were suddenly forced to seek new ground, safer rulers, or any space that promised survival. That pushed them closer to Roman lands, and, once movement began, farther inside. What makes this so gripping is the sense of pressure building from behind. Rome was not merely confronting ambition from the outside. It was encountering displaced peoples whose decisions had been shaped by terror elsewhere. That makes the frontier feel less like a wall and more like the meeting point of different crises. A family, a war band, or an entire confederation might cross not because Rome looked weak, but because staying behind looked worse. The empire became the destination of fear, and that changed everything about how its borders were tested. A distant nomadic empire helped trigger Rome's western collapse indirectly. There is something almost unbelievable about the scale of this connection. Forces gathering far from Italy, far from Gaul, and far from the old centers of Roman power could still help decide the fate of the Western Empire. The Huns emerged from a world of steppe politics and mobility that was very different from Rome's urban and administrative civilization. Yet their expansion disturbed the peoples between those worlds, and that disturbance traveled westward. Rome did not need to be conquered by the Huns for their impact to matter. It only needed to be caught in the chain of consequences they set in motion. That is why the fall of Rome feels so vast. The empire's crisis was not sealed inside its own map. Events from distant horizons entered the story through migration, fear, and realigned power. A Western state already under strain now had to absorb pressures partly created by transformations that began beyond the reach of Roman policy or imagination. Rome faced not one invasion, but a chain reaction of migrations. This is one of the most important ways to understand the drama of the West. It was not simply a case of one enemy smashing into Rome and bringing everything down. Instead, pressures spread from group to group, region to region, and frontier to frontier. One movement triggered another. One disrupted people displaced the next. What looked from afar like a single barbarian wave was, in reality, a tangled sequence of migrations, negotiations, resettlements, panicked crossings, and violent ruptures. That made the crisis much harder to control. Rome could defeat an army, it could bargain with a leader. But a chain reaction of human movement across a huge landscape was far more difficult to contain. Every new arrival created fresh decisions and fresh risks. This gives the fall of Rome a strange modern resonance. It was not only a military emergency, it was a systems crisis where motion itself became the problem, and every attempted solution altered the balance somewhere else. In the year 406, the Rhine frontier burst open. For generations, the Rhine had marked one of the great edges of Roman order in the northwest. Forts, watchfulness, military presence, and diplomacy all helped make it feel like a defended line between imperial territory and the uncertain worlds beyond. Then, in 406, that line failed dramatically. Groups crossed into Gaul in a moment that later historians would remember as a major breach in the Western system. Whether the river itself froze or whether other conditions made passage possible, the deeper meaning is clear. A frontier that had symbolized containment no longer contained. Once that happened, the consequences spread quickly. The empire now faced powerful movements inside one of its core western regions, and the challenge was no longer hypothetical or distant. This is such a gripping moment, because a border can seem secure for years, then suddenly reveal how fragile security really was. The Rhine did not merely mark geography. It marked the breaking of Roman confidence in the northwest. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed into Gaul during winter chaos. There is something cinematic about this moment, though the reality was far harsher than any legend. In the cold season, when order and movement were both harder to manage, several major groups entered Gaul together, or in close succession, and the Western Empire was forced to confront a crisis of scale. These were not minor raiding parties slipping in and out for plunder. They were substantial peoples with leaders, followers, and momentum. Gaul, one of the great Western provinces, now had to absorb the shock of their presence, while Roman authorities struggled to respond. Winter gives the scene a special force in the imagination. It suggests urgency, exposure, and a frontier caught off balance at the worst possible time. What makes this episode so important is not only who crossed, but what their crossing revealed. Roman power in the region could no longer guarantee exclusion. The empire had lost the ability to decide, with its old certainty, who entered and who stayed out. Once inside the empire, migrating peoples became impossible to fully contain. Crossing the frontier was only the beginning. After that came the far more difficult question of what Rome could actually do with large groups already moving through imperial lands. Some might be settled. Some might be fought. Some might split, bargain, or move again. The old idea of a frontier crisis, where danger appeared at the edge and could be pushed back beyond it, no longer fit the situation. Now the challenge existed within the empire itself. Roads, river valleys, towns, and provinces became part of the problem. Roman officials were no longer deciding only whether to admit people. They were trying to steer populations that had already entered a weakening system and had their own aims, fears, and leaders. That is what makes this phase of the story so dramatic. Control becomes diffuse. Every map line looks less final. Once movement crossed from the frontier into the interior, the empire faced not a single campaign, but an ongoing struggle to manage human forces too large and too mobile for clean solutions. Provinces that fed Rome became battlegrounds beyond imperial control. A great empire depends on productive regions that do more than exist on a map. They must supply grain, taxes, manpower, transport, and stability. In the Western crisis, several provinces that should have sustained Roman strength instead became places of conflict, disruption, and contested authority. Fields could no longer be counted on in the same way when warbands moved through them. when administrations faltered, or when rival powers fought for possession. The transformation is striking. Land that once nourished the state now drained it. Instead of dependable support, Rome found itself grappling with insecurity in territories it badly needed to remain peaceful and profitable. This is one reason the collapse of the West feels so inexorable. The empire was not just losing distant prestige. It was losing the reliable functioning of the regions that helped keep the whole machine alive. When breadlands and taxlands become war zones, even the sophisticated imperial system begins to starve politically, financially, and strategically. Britain was abandoned as Rome struggled to save more vital regions. The end of Roman Britain has a lonely, unforgettable quality. At the far edge of the empire, communities that had long been connected to Roman administration, military protection, and culture found themselves increasingly cut off as the Western government fought for survival elsewhere. Troops were withdrawn. Attention shifted. Appeals for help carried less force when the empire faced urgent threats closer to its continental heartlands. Britain was not lost because it suddenly ceased to matter to everyone living there. It was lost because Rome had begun making brutal choices about priority. That is what gives this episode its emotional power. An empire that once projected authority across seas and frontiers now had to contract, and contraction meant leaving some lands behind. For the people in Britain, Roman rule faded not in one theatrical instant, but through neglect, absence, and diminishing connection. The frontier province became a measure of Western weakness, because Rome could no longer be present everywhere it had once claimed to rule. Roman rule faded in Britain long before legends filled the silence. When Rome withdrew from Britain, the end did not arrive like a curtain dropping in one dramatic motion. It came more like a tide going out, leaving familiar structures standing while the force behind them disappeared. Town walls still existed. Villas still stood. Roads still cut across the landscape. But the imperial system that had paid soldiers, enforced law, and linked the province to a wider Roman world was no longer reliably present. That gap is what makes Britain so haunting. People were left with the shell of Roman order and the growing reality of local improvisation. Leaders had to solve problems without the old machine behind them. Communities had to defend themselves or seek new patrons. Into that uncertain space, memory and legend later poured, including stories that would grow into the Arthurian tradition. Yet before myth took hold, there was a more fragile truth, which was a Roman province learning what life felt like after empire stopped answering. Gaul became a patchwork of Roman cities and rising barbarian kingdoms. Gaul is fascinating because it did not simply switch from Roman to non-Roman in a neat, clean moment. Instead, it became a layered world where old civic life and new political powers overlapped uneasily. Roman cities still mattered. Bishops still held influence. Aristocrats still used Roman language, law, and cultural habits. Yet around and between those centers, new kingdoms were rising, led by peoples who had once been outsiders to imperial rule. Burgundians, Visigoths, and Franks each carved out positions within the weakening Western framework. The result was not immediate chaos everywhere, but an extraordinary mixture of continuity and transformation. A Roman town might still look Roman while the wider political map around it changed dramatically. That makes Gaul one of the best places to feel the true texture of Rome's fall. The empire was not replaced in one blow. It was gradually overlaid by new powers that learned to rule among the surviving bones of Roman civilization. Spain slipped from firm imperial control into contested and fractured rule. Hispania had once been one of Rome's deeply integrated regions, rich in resources, tied into imperial administration, and shaped for centuries by Roman law and culture. That is why its unraveling matters so much. When control weakened there, it showed that even long Romanized provinces were not immune to the wider crisis. Different groups moved through and into the peninsula, and authority became increasingly unstable. Some regions changed hands. Some local elites adapted to new rulers. Some areas remained under lingering Roman influence longer than others. What makes Spain so compelling in this story is that it reveals how uneven the fall could be. A province did not simply flip from order to disorder in one instant. It passed through layers of uncertainty, negotiation, and shifting control. The Western Empire could still claim rule in theory, yet practice told another story. Power became fractured, and the old confidence that Rome could shape the whole peninsula according to its will slowly ebbed away. North Africa was Rome's breadbasket, until the Vandals seized it. North Africa was not some distant ornament at the edge of the Roman world. It was one of the most valuable regions the Western Empire possessed. Its fertile lands supplied grain in enormous quantities, and its cities were wealthy, urban, and deeply tied into Roman economic life. To control Africa was to hold one of the great engines of Western stability. That is what makes the Vandal seizure so dramatic. When they crossed from Spain into Africa and began taking territory, they were not merely grabbing land. They were threatening the food supply, tax base, and strategic heart of the Western state. Carthage and the African provinces had long helped sustain imperial strength. Now they became the prize of a new power. The fall of Rome becomes especially vivid here because the struggle is no longer abstract. You can feel the empire losing one of the places that fed it, enriched it, and helped make Western rule materially possible. Losing Africa starved the West of grain, wealth, and leverage. When the Western Empire lost North Africa, it lost much more than a prosperous territory on a map. It lost one of its strongest sources of dependable revenue and supply. Grain from Africa mattered to urban life and political stability. Taxes from Africa mattered to state finance. Control of Africa also mattered in diplomacy and war, because a ruler who held such a rich region possessed bargaining power that others had to respect. Once that region was gone, the West became poorer in every sense that mattered. Its room for action shrank. It had fewer resources to reward allies, fewer means to fund military recovery, and less confidence in its own strategic depth. That is why Africa's loss feels so decisive. Empires can survive defeats on the frontier for a time, but losing a core source of sustenance is far more dangerous. The Western state was not merely wounded. It was deprived of one of the foundations that helped keep the whole structure standing. Carthage fell to the Vandals, and the Western Empire never recovered. Carthage had once been Rome's great rival in the ancient struggle for the Western Mediterranean. Centuries later, as a Roman city, it had become one of the jewels of imperial Africa. Rich, connected, and strategically placed, it was a place of immense consequence. So when the Vandals captured it in 439, the shock was immense. This was not a remote outpost changing hands. It was one of the most important cities in the Western world falling to a power outside imperial control. From there, the Vandals gained resources, legitimacy, and a base from which to shape events across the sea. For the Western Empire, the loss was crippling. Efforts to reverse it would fail, and the balance never truly returned. That is what gives the moment its force. A city famous since the days of Hannibal now became the center of a new anti-Roman power, and the West was left staring at a wound it could no longer close. Control of the sea began slipping away when Rome lost North Africa. Roman power had always depended not only on roads and armies, but on mastery of the sea lanes that connected its provinces. The Mediterranean was the great highway of empire, carrying grain, officials, soldiers, messages, and trade from one shore to another. Once North Africa passed out of Western Roman hands, that maritime world became much more dangerous. Ports that had supported imperial circulation could now support rival activity. Coastal movement was no longer something Rome could take for granted. Sea control is easy to overlook because it feels invisible when it works. Ships arrive. Supplies flow. Communication holds. But when control starts to slip, the weakness spreads quickly. Distances feel longer. Islands feel more exposed. Coastal cities feel less secure. That is what makes this shift so gripping. The Western Empire was not just losing land. It was losing the watery network that had helped bind that land together. Once the sea grew less Roman, the West grew much more vulnerable. The Vandals built a fleet that challenged Roman power in the Mediterranean. This is one of the most surprising twists in the story, because people often imagine the Vandals only as land-based raiders remembered for destruction. In reality, after securing North Africa, they developed serious maritime strength. With ships, they could strike islands, threaten coasts, disrupt movement, and project power far beyond their immediate kingdom. That changed the balance in the Western Mediterranean. Rome had once dominated these waters so completely that control could seem almost natural. Now, a new force was using the sea not just for travel, but for strategy. That is thrilling in historical terms because it shows the Western Empire facing an enemy that had learned to exploit the very environment that helped make Rome great. Islands such as Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica became more vulnerable under this new pressure. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake in imagination, was becoming a contested space, and that meant the West had to confront danger moving swiftly across the water. Rome's enemies learned to use ships, diplomacy, and Roman weakness together. The later Western Empire was not brought low by brute force alone. Its opponents became more effective when they learned how to combine different forms of pressure at once. A rival kingdom could negotiate with one Roman faction while threatening another. A fleet could raid the coast while envoys bargained for recognition. Former imperial outsiders learned to play within the Roman political world as well as against it. That is what makes the final centuries so engrossing. Rome was no longer facing enemies who stood entirely outside its methods. It faced powers that understood timing, leverage, and the value of turning imperial division to their own advantage. Military force still mattered, of course, but it worked best when paired with strategy and patience. This is a more complex and more fascinating picture than simple invasion. Rome's rivals were not just crashing against the empire. They were learning how to maneuver through its fractures and make its own weakness part of their strength. The sack of Rome in 410 stunned the ancient world. When Alaric and his forces entered Rome in 410, the event struck the Roman world with extraordinary psychological force. The city was no longer the practical seat of Western government, yet it remained the symbolic center of an entire civilization. To hear that it had been taken and plundered was to feel that something once thought impossible had happened at last. Writers reacted with grief, disbelief, and dread. Some saw it as divine punishment. Others saw it as proof that the old order had become mortal in a new way. That is what makes the sack so unforgettable. Its power lay not only in what was stolen or damaged, but in what it did to the imagination. Rome had been treated for centuries as the city that anchored the world. Now that anchor had been shaken loose. The shock rippled far beyond Italy, because the meaning of Rome had always extended far beyond its walls. Alaric had served Rome before he marched against its greatest symbol. That is one of the most gripping ironies in the whole story. Alaric was not some stranger from a distant world who appeared without warning at Rome's gates. He had operated within the Roman military sphere and knew how imperial power worked, where its rewards lay, and how its promises could fail. He wanted rank, security, and recognition for himself and his followers. Again and again, he dealt with Roman authorities who tried to use him, delay him, or deny him what he believed had been earned. Out of that frustration grew something far more dangerous than simple hostility. A man shaped by Rome's system turned against its most famous city. That makes the drama feel personal as well as political. The empire was not only failing to defeat enemies, it was failing to manage men it had already drawn close. When Alaric marched on Rome, he did so with the knowledge of someone who understood the empire from the inside. Rome's first sack in centuries felt like the end of time. For people raised on the grandeur of Roman power, the sack of 410 did not feel like one bad military setback among many. It felt apocalyptic. Rome had occupied such a commanding place in memory and imagination that its violation seemed to shake the structure of the world itself. Even those who knew the emperor no longer ruled from the city could not easily separate practical politics from sacred symbolism. This was Rome. This was the old heart of empire. To hear that armed men had entered it and plundered it was to feel history itself lurching into a darker age. That is why reactions were so intense. The event struck the nerves of an entire civilization. It did not merely frighten people, it destabilized their sense of continuity. When a place seems eternal, any wound to it can feel cosmic. In that sense, the sack mattered because it shattered emotional time as much as it damaged a city. St. Jerome wrote that the whole world seemed to perish with Rome. Jerome's reaction captures the emotional thunder of the moment better than any dry political summary could. Writing far from the city itself, he described the news of Rome's sack in language of grief so vast that it seemed to swallow the whole world. That response matters because it shows how far Rome's symbolic reach extended. A Christian scholar living in Bethlehem still felt the blow, as though the foundations of civilization had cracked beneath him. The city's power was not only military or administrative, it was psychological, cultural, and spiritual. Jerome's words reveal a late antique world in which Rome remained the measure of order, even for people who also believed in a kingdom beyond earthly empires. This is part of what makes the fall of Rome so compelling. The event did not live only in maps and campaigns. It lived in frightened hearts, in letters, in sermons, and in the shocked language of people trying to describe the unimaginable. The city survived the sack, but its invincibility did not. That contrast is essential. Rome was not erased in 410. Its buildings still stood. Its churches still functioned. Its population endured. Life went on, though damaged and shaken. Yet something less visible, and perhaps even more important, had been lost. The old aura of untouchability was gone. For centuries, Rome had seemed protected not merely by walls and soldiers, but by the weight of its own history. That illusion was now broken in a way that could not be repaired by rebuilding or ritual. People had seen the impossible happen. Once that threshold is crossed, every future threat feels different. The city can still be inhabited, admired and revered, yet the spell has ended. That is why this moment lingers so powerfully in memory. Material survival and symbolic survival are not the same thing. Rome lived on after the sack, but it lived on as a city newly exposed, newly mortal, and permanently stripped of the old certainty that had once surrounded its name. News of Rome's humiliation echoed from monasteries to imperial courts. The shock of Rome's sack did not stay in Italy. It spread along the communication networks of late antiquity, carried in letters, reports, sermons, and anxious conversation. Monks copied reflections on the disaster. Bishops wrestled with what it meant for Christian history. Court circles weighed the political consequences. In distant provinces, The event arrived not as rumor alone, but as a wound to the shared world people thought they inhabited. That wide echo is one reason the fall of Rome feels so immense. The city's humiliation became a topic of thought from cloistered communities to centers of power. Different people interpreted it differently. Some turned to repentance. Some blamed imperial failure. Some saw proof that earthly glory was unstable by nature. Yet across those different responses ran one common feeling, which was that a boundary had been crossed. The most famous city in the West had been humbled, and everyone who heard the news had to recalculate what still felt secure in the world. The sack of 455 was longer and more systematic. When the Vandals entered Rome in 455, the city suffered a different kind of ordeal from the sack carried out by Alaric. This later attack unfolded over a longer span and appears to have involved more organized removal of wealth, captives, and portable prestige. The effect is chilling. It was not only a violent intrusion into a sacred symbol, it was an extraction of value from a city that still contained immense treasure, memory, and status. By this point, Rome had already lost much of its old political centrality, yet it remained worth plundering on a grand scale. That alone tells you how powerful its legacy still was. The later sack also deepened the sense that the Western world had entered a harsher phase, where even the old capital could be harvested by ambitious outsiders. Rome was no longer merely vulnerable in theory. It had become a repeatedly usable prize in the brutal politics of the collapsing West. The word vandalism later grew from the memory of Vandal destruction. This is one of those rare moments when the fall of Rome reaches directly into the language people still use today. Centuries after the Vandals had vanished as a living power, their name survived as a shorthand for senseless destruction. That legacy tells us as much about memory as it does about the historical Vandals themselves. Later generations looked back at the sack of Rome and transformed one people into a symbol of cultural ruin. Whether that memory was always fair in every detail is another question. The Vandals also ruled, negotiated, worshipped, and governed. Yet posterity chose to preserve them most vividly as destroyers. That is fascinating because it shows how the fall of Rome did not end when kingdoms rose and fell. It continued in imagination, in moral lessons, and in the words that history left behind. Few events shape language so deeply. The Vandals lost their kingdom long ago, but their name still carries the shadow of Rome's trauma. Rome became a prize because it remained rich in meaning and treasure. By the 5th century, Rome was no longer directing the Western Empire in the old way, yet it still held extraordinary value. Some of that value was material. The city contained churches, noble houses, artworks, sacred objects, and accumulated wealth from centuries of prestige. Some of it was symbolic. To take Rome was to seize not just possessions, but meaning. It was to lay hands on the most resonant name in the Western world. That is why weakened Rome could still attract conquerors. Its practical importance had declined, but its cultural gravity remained immense. A city can lose administrative centrality and still retain immense power as a trophy. That paradox helps explain why Rome suffered repeated sacks. It was not ignored because it was fading. It was targeted because even in decline, it remained the grandest symbol of what power once looked like. To possess Rome, even briefly, was to touch the memory of empire itself. Even weakened, the city of Rome still dazzled conquerors and chroniclers. Imagine arriving in a city layered with triumphal monuments, vast churches, ancient forums, palaces, arches, statues, and the accumulated grandeur of centuries. Even diminished Rome could still overwhelm the eye and imagination. Visitors entered a place where the physical scale of the past remained astonishing, even when the political world that built it had changed beyond recognition. That contrast made the city unforgettable. Conquerors saw wealth, prestige, and the chance to claim association with greatness. Chroniclers saw a landscape dense with memory, where every stone seemed to speak of former dominion. This helps explain why Rome held such fascination long after its practical supremacy had waned. Magnificence can outlast power by a very long time. The city remained a theater of empire even when the empire itself was fragmenting. That is part of its enduring magic in this story. Rome could still captivate those who entered it, because ruins and splendor together created a vision no ordinary city could match. Emperors in Ravenna watched disasters unfold from marshes and palace walls. Ravenna was chosen for safety, and in that choice lies a whole mood of late Western Rome. Surrounded by marshland and easier to defend than the old capital, it offered protection in a dangerous age. Its harbors and fortifications made it a practical seat for a threatened court. Yet there is something haunting about the Western emperors ruling from there while catastrophe spread elsewhere. From Ravenna, they could issue orders, receive envoys, and stage imperial ceremony. But the city's very defensiveness symbolized a shrinking horizon. The court was sheltering rather than commanding. That is what gives Ravenna such power in the story. It feels like a fortress for an empire on the defensive, beautiful in its own way, yet separated from the grand civic theater of Rome. While sacks, invasions, and losses reshaped the West, emperors remained behind marshes and walls, presiding over a world they could no longer fully direct. Ravenna was safer than Rome, but also farther from old authority. Ravenna made sense on a military map. Its marshes, waterways, and defensible position gave the Western court a better chance of survival than the exposed majesty of Rome. An emperor could hide there, organize there, and hope to outlast sudden threats. Yet safety came with a cost that was harder to measure. Ravenna did not carry the same ancestral weight, the same political theater, or the same emotional command as the old capital. To rule from there was practical, but it also meant ruling at a distance from the Senate, from the monuments of conquest, and from the deep memory that had once surrounded imperial power. That distance mattered. Authority is not only about issuing orders. It is also about being seen at the center of inherited legitimacy. Ravenna protected emperors from danger, but it also revealed how much the Western Empire now depended on defensiveness rather than confidence, shelter rather than presence, and survival rather than command. Court politics became increasingly detached from the empire it claimed to rule. As the Western court retreated into safer capitals and more insulated circles, a dangerous gap opened between imperial politics and provincial reality. At court, men competed for offices, titles, marriages, and influence over the emperor. They whispered, plotted, and maneuvered inside a world of ceremony that still looked impressively Roman. Beyond that polished setting, provinces were being lost, tax bases were shrinking, and local communities were facing pressures the court could not always solve. This contrast gives the late empire much of its tragic power. The palace could still generate endless intrigue, even while the state beneath it was weakening. Energy that might have been spent on long-term recovery was often consumed by rivalries among those closest to the throne. That does not mean every court figure was foolish. It means the political system had become inward-looking at exactly the moment when clear outward control mattered most. The empire still had a center, but that center was listening more to itself than to the world. Powerful generals overshadowed emperors who looked imperial but ruled little. In the final Western decades, the image of empire often survived better than the substance. Emperors still wore the robes, received embassies, and embodied the legal majesty of Roman rule. Yet behind or beside them stood generals whose command of armies gave them the real leverage. This created one of the strangest spectacles in late antiquity. The emperor could appear supreme in ceremony, while another man shaped appointments, strategy, and succession. It was a world where appearances had to be maintained because imperial legitimacy still mattered, yet everyone close to power understood that force lay elsewhere. That tension is fascinating because it makes the Western court feel almost theatrical. The emperor remained necessary as a symbol, but symbols are vulnerable when they depend too heavily on protectors who can also become masters. Rome had not abolished the throne. It had allowed it to become increasingly hollow, and into that hollow stepped military strongmen who ruled without always claiming the title itself. Stilicho tried to save the West, then died in a purge. Stilicho stands out as one of the great might-have-been figures of the late West. Of mixed background but fully embedded in Roman power, he rose to become the leading general of the Western Empire and the guardian of the young emperor Honorius. He fought invasions, balanced rival threats, and tried to hold together a world already under immense strain. Whatever his limitations, he was one of the few men in a position to think strategically about the West as a whole. That is what makes his end so chilling. Court enemies turned against him, suspicion grew, and he was executed in 408. In the panic that followed, many barbarian soldiers and their families tied to Roman service were massacred, which drove survivors toward Alaric. The sequence is extraordinary in its self-destruction. At a moment of severe danger, the Western court eliminated one of its strongest commanders and helped push more armed men into hostile hands. After Stilicho's death, Rome lost one of its ablest defenders. The years after Stilicho's execution revealed just how costly that decision had been. He had been one of the few Western leaders with the stature, experience, and authority to coordinate a broad response to the empire's overlapping threats. Once he was gone, the political field did not suddenly fill with equally capable replacements. Instead, fragmentation deepened. Alaric faced weaker opposition. Negotiation became more erratic. The court lurched between fear and indecision. What makes this so gripping is that the loss was not only military. It was strategic. Stilicho had served as a hinge between army, court, and frontier politics. Remove such a figure, and the whole mechanism grows less coherent. This is one reason the fall of Rome can feel so agonizing. The empire did not merely suffer from external pressure. It repeatedly removed some of the very people most able to manage that pressure. In doing so, it narrowed its own chances and made later disasters more likely, more sudden, and harder to reverse. Aetius used diplomacy and barbarian alliances to hold collapse at bay. Flavius Aetius is fascinating because he defended Rome not by restoring the old world exactly, but by navigating the new one with rare skill. The Western Empire no longer had the easy dominance to command every frontier outright. Survival required bargaining, balancing, and making use of forces that earlier generations might have tried simply to crush. Aetius understood that. He worked with Hunnic power at some moments, negotiated among rival groups, and used alliances with barbarian forces as part of Western strategy. That kind of leadership demanded flexibility as much as courage. He was operating in a political landscape where Roman strength alone was no longer enough, so he turned fractured realities into temporary advantages. For a time, it worked. The West did not become secure, but it remained standing. That is part of what makes him so compelling. He was not a hero from a simpler age. He was a late Roman survivor, holding together a failing system through diplomacy, calculation, and sheer political dexterity. The general who stopped Attila was later murdered by his emperor. Attius reached his most famous triumph when Roman and Allied forces confronted Attila in Gaul and halted his advance at the Catalonian plains. The victory was imperfect and debated in detail, yet its meaning was immense. One of the most feared war leaders of the age had been checked, and Attius stood at the center of that achievement. You might expect such a man to become untouchable. Instead, his very success helped make him dangerous in imperial eyes. Emperor Valentinian III grew suspicious of his power, perhaps fearing that the general had become too great to control. In 454, the emperor killed him with his own hand during a palace audience. It is one of the most astonishing murders in Roman history. A ruler destroyed the commander who had done more than almost anyone else to preserve the West. The scene feels almost unbearable because it captures late Rome at its most self-defeating and afraid of its own strength. Rome kept killing the men most capable of defending it. There is a grim pattern running through the late Western Empire. Again and again, figures who possessed military skill, broad influence, or genuine strategic ability became targets of court suspicion. They were not always innocent, and power in Rome had never been a gentle business. Yet the pattern remained striking. The state desperately needed competent defenders, then treated their prominence as a threat to imperial security. That created a vicious trap. To save the West, a general had to become powerful. Once powerful, he became frightening to a court already haunted by usurpation and betrayal. So the empire weakened itself by cutting down the very men who could still hold parts of it together. This is one of the most tragic features of Rome's end, because it reveals not simple bad luck, but a system turning against its own remaining strengths. The Western state had become so politically brittle that self-preservation at court could mean self-sabotage for the empire as a whole. Ricimer ruled from behind the throne without ever wearing the crown. Ricimer is one of the most intriguing figures in the final decades of the West because he exercised immense power while never becoming emperor himself. Of partly barbarian background, he rose through military command and became the true broker of Western politics in Italy. He could elevate emperors, undermine them, or replace them, yet the crown remained just beyond his reach. Perhaps his origins made formal accession too difficult. Perhaps he judged that ruling indirectly was safer. Either way, he became a master of shadow authority. This arrangement reveals how strange late Roman power had become. The imperial office still possessed prestige and legality, but the man who controlled armies and court access could dominate the state without claiming the highest title. Ricimer's career feels almost like a study in political twilight. The old forms remained, but the substance had shifted into other hands. He did not abolish the imperial system. He manipulated it, and in doing so exposed how fragile and performative it had become. Puppet emperors became common as military strongmen controlled the court. By the later 5th century, the Western throne often looked less like the commanding center of empire and more like a seat occupied at the pleasure of stronger men nearby. Emperors came and went with startling speed. Some were elevated because they were acceptable, manageable, or useful to the military power behind them. Their reigns could be brief, uncertain, and heavily constrained from the start. This made the imperial title feel both indispensable and diminished. It still mattered because Rome's political culture needed legitimacy, ancestry, and legal continuity. Yet it mattered in a world where the real decision often lay elsewhere. That contrast is what gives the period such eerie fascination. The empire continued acting out the rituals of sovereignty even as sovereignty itself had become fractured. A puppet emperor is not merely a weak ruler. He is a sign that the state still believes in its symbols while no longer trusting them to govern alone. That is a powerful image of Rome's final Western decades. Imperial titles survived even when real power had nearly vanished. One of the strangest features of the late Western Empire is how long the language of greatness outlived the reality behind it. Men were still called Emperor, Augustus, and Lord of the Roman world, even when their reach barely extended beyond Italy or the court that surrounded them. Official documents still carried the old majesty. Ceremonies still wrapped rulers in the aura of universal command. Yet everyone close to events could see how narrow that command had become. Provinces were gone. Armies answered to stronger men. Revenues had thinned. The titles remained vast, while the power beneath them had become small and fragile. That contrast is deeply fascinating because it shows Rome living inside its own memory. The empire could still speak in the voice of a world ruler, even after the world had slipped from its grasp. In late antiquity, words were not empty, but they were increasingly forced to carry more weight than the state itself could still bear. Some Western emperors reigned briefly enough to feel almost forgotten. There is something haunting about rulers who wore the crown of Rome and then vanished into the blur of history almost at once. In the final Western decades, emperors could be raised, discarded, murdered, or replaced so quickly that their reigns barely had time to leave a mark on the wider world. Some ruled for months. Some mattered mainly because someone else had chosen them. This rapid turnover did more than confuse the succession. It made the throne feel unstable, almost disposable, in a civilization that had once treated it as the axis of order. The effect on memory is striking. Famous emperors from Rome's earlier centuries still glow with myth and personality. These later figures often flicker and disappear. Yet that very obscurity tells its own story. When the empire could no longer sustain durable rule, even its highest office became transient. The forgotten emperors are fascinating because their very faintness reveals how quickly Western imperial authority was evaporating before the title itself finally disappeared. Legitimacy mattered deeply, even when armies decided everything. It might seem that once soldiers dominated politics, legal titles and formal approval would stop mattering. Yet late Rome shows the opposite. Force could place a man on the throne, but legitimacy still gave that power shape, recognition, and endurance. A ruler wanted not only troops, but acceptance from the court, the Senate, the Eastern Emperor, the Church, or influential elites. Even strongmen who controlled armies often needed an emperor to stand beside them because Roman political culture still cared intensely about lawful appearance. This is part of what makes the period so compelling. Naked power was never quite enough on its own. Men fought for symbols because symbols still worked. They wanted the seal of Roman continuity, even inside a world increasingly ruled by military pressure. That tension gave late Western politics its peculiar texture. Swords might decide the moment, but legitimacy decided whether that moment could be presented as rightful order rather than mere seizure. Rome was crumbling, yet it still demanded a performance of lawful power. The Senate still existed, though it no longer commanded the empire. The Roman Senate had once been the beating political heart of the Republic, the body through which ambitious men contended for glory and statecraft. By the late Empire, that age was long gone. Yet the Senate itself endured, especially in Rome, carrying prestige, wealth, and the memory of an older order. Senators still mattered as landowners, patrons, and public figures. They could influence opinion, support claimants, and help maintain civic life. But they no longer governed the empire as their ancestors had imagined. That makes their survival so evocative. The Senate became less a commanding institution and more a noble relic that still possessed dignity. It stood as a living reminder that Rome's past had not vanished, even while the structures of imperial rule weakened around it. In a city filled with monuments, the Senate was itself almost a monument in human form. It remained part of Roman identity, though the world it had once helped direct was already slipping beyond its control. Roman aristocrats adapted cleverly as imperial structures weakened around them. One reason Roman civilization did not simply collapse into blank ruin is that its elites were highly skilled at adaptation. Aristocratic families had wealth, education, local influence, and deep experience in navigating power. When imperial structures weakened, many did not disappear. They adjusted. Some served new rulers while preserving Roman cultural habits. Some shifted from imperial office into church leadership or local patronage. Some invested more heavily in their estates and regional networks as central authority became less dependable. This flexibility is fascinating because it shows survival not as heroism in battle, but as social intelligence. Roman aristocrats understood how to endure political change by translating old status into new forms. They could flatter barbarian kings, sponsor churches, negotiate tax burdens, or preserve learning within changing circumstances. The Western Empire was fragmenting, yet the upper layers of Roman society often proved remarkably resilient. In that sense, the fall of Rome was not only a story of destruction, it was also a story of elite reinvention. Bishops gained influence as emperors lost reach, revenue, and trust. As imperial government became less effective in many Western regions, bishops often emerged as figures of unusual stability. They were educated, visible, and tied to communities in ways that imperial officials increasingly were not. People could turn to them for charity, mediation, advocacy, and leadership during crisis. In cities facing insecurity or political change, a bishop might matter more in daily life than a distant emperor. That shift is extraordinary because it shows authority moving from the old machinery of state into a religious office that had once existed alongside it. Bishops did not simply preach. They negotiated with rulers, defended towns, and spoke for local populations. Their influence grew partly because the empire was fading in practical terms. When tax systems weakened, military protection became uncertain, and state presence thinned, trusted local leadership became more valuable. This helped reshape the Western world. Moral authority and civic authority began to overlap in new ways, and bishops stood at the center of that transformation. Christianity outlasted the empire and inherited parts of its world. The Western Empire fell, but Christianity remained, and in remaining, it absorbed some of the space Rome had once filled. The Church inherited cities, buildings, languages, habits of administration, and a map of communities already shaped by Roman rule. It also inherited the task of linking distant places through shared belief and recognized authority. That does not mean the Church became the empire in disguise. It means that when imperial structures weakened, Christianity was one of the institutions strong enough to carry elements of Roman continuity forward. This is one of the most fascinating turns in the story. A faith that had once been persecuted by Roman authorities became one of the chief heirs to Rome's social landscape. The empire's political shell cracked, but Christian networks endured across that broken ground. In the centuries that followed, the Church would help preserve memory, organize communities, and give the post-Roman world a framework that still bore the imprint of imperial civilization, though transformed into something new. The Church preserved Roman habits even as Roman government receded. When Western imperial administration began to thin out, not every Roman habit vanished with it. Many survived through the Church. Bishops kept records. Councils gathered to debate and decide. Clergy moved through cities connected by letters, hierarchy, and legal reasoning. Latin remained central in worship and communication across much of the West. Even the sense that order should be expressed through offices, procedures, and written authority owed much to the Roman world Christianity had grown within. That continuity is captivating because it reveals how a civilization can retreat politically while still enduring institutionally. Government might recede from daily life, yet Roman ways of organizing thought, authority, and communication could continue under new guardians. The Church was not preserving everything unchanged. It was selecting, adapting, and redirecting inherited forms towards spiritual and communal purposes. Still, the resemblance mattered. In many places, Roman government faded from view, while Roman habits lived on in cathedrals, councils, correspondence, and the disciplined structures of Christian life. Monasteries later protected texts from a civilization already fragmenting. As the Western world became more politically fractured, monasteries would gain a quiet but profound role in preserving pieces of the ancient past. Monks copied manuscripts, guarded libraries, and passed along works that might otherwise have vanished in a more chaotic age. This matters because the fall of Rome was not only about armies and kings. It was also about memory, and whether a civilization's words could survive after its state had weakened. The monastic world became one of the places where that survival happened. A poem, a sermon, a history, or a philosophical text might endure because someone in a religious house found it worth copying by hand. That image is extraordinary. While the great public machinery of empire had broken apart, smaller disciplined communities were helping carry its intellectual inheritance forward. They were not trying to rebuild imperial government. Yet in preserving texts, they preserved voices. Rome's political order could fail, while parts of Rome's mind still passed onward through parchment and patient labor. The fall of Rome was political collapse, not the end of civilization. This may be the most important perspective of all. The Western Empire did fall as a political structure. Emperors vanished. Provinces broke away. Central command failed. Yet the people, languages, beliefs, laws, roads, towns, and memories shaped by Rome did not simply disappear into emptiness. Life continued, though changed. New kingdoms rose in old provinces. Roman customs mixed with new traditions. Christian institutions expanded. Latin endured and evolved. Local societies adapted to a world without a Western emperor, but not without all traces of Rome. That is what makes this story so much richer than a tale of darkness swallowing light. It is a story of collapse and continuation at the same time. Something enormous ended, but much else was transformed rather than erased. The wonder of Rome's fall lies partly there. A civilization can lose its state and still live on through culture, faith, law, language, and imagination. The empire died in one form, while its legacy kept moving through history. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial insignia east. The final gesture of the Western Empire was not a blazing coronation or a last doomed battle. It was the removal of a boy emperor and the sending of imperial insignia to Constantinople. In 476, Odoacer, a military leader in Italy, deposed Romulus Augustulus and chose not to appoint another Western emperor in his place. Instead, the symbols of office went east, as if to admit that one emperor was now enough for the Roman world. That moment feels quiet on the surface, yet it is charged with meaning. The West did not end through complete annihilation. It ended through political subtraction. A throne simply ceased to be filled. That is what makes the scene so haunting. The imperial court in the West had become too weak to sustain its own continuity, and Odoacer understood that legitimacy could be managed more effectively by acknowledging the Eastern emperor than by pretending the old Western line still possessed real force. The last Western emperor's name echoed Rome's founder and first emperor. There is something almost too perfect about the name Romulus Augustulus. It sounds like a closing circle written by history itself. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome, the figure placed at the city's mythical beginning. Augustus was the title of the first emperor who gave the Roman world its enduring imperial form. And now, at the western end of that long story, the boy on the throne carried echoes of both. The effect is uncanny. It makes the final act feel as though Rome was speaking in symbols, even while its political power faded. Yet the name also reveals something more human and sad. Grandeur of title could no longer guarantee grandeur of rule. A child bearing the weight of Rome's oldest memories could not restore the empire those memories belonged to. That is why his name lingers so powerfully. It sounds like destiny, but it arrived at a moment when destiny had already slipped beyond the Western throne's reach. Romulus Augustulus was probably more a symbol than a ruler. By the time Romulus Augustulus became emperor, the office in the West had already been reduced to something fragile and manipulated. He was elevated by his father, Orestes, a powerful military figure who expected to govern through him. That makes the young emperor fascinating, because he stands at the exact point where imperial majesty and political emptiness meet. He had the title, the robes, and the formal status, but very little independent command. Decisions that mattered were being shaped by stronger adults, stronger armies, and stronger realities than any child could control. In that sense, he was almost a living emblem of the Western Empire's last condition. The forms still existed, but the force behind them had drained away. This is why his reign has such emotional power. The end of Western Rome was embodied not by a titan, but by a boy whose very presence on the throne revealed how ceremonial and vulnerable imperial authority had become in its final days. In 476, the West lost an emperor, not instantly its people. It is important to feel the human scale of that year. When the Western imperial throne disappeared, millions of people did not suddenly vanish into mist, and daily life did not stop overnight. Farmers still worked fields. Clergy still led worship. Officials still kept records. Traders still moved goods. Families still spoke Latin and lived among Roman roads, walls, and laws. What ended in 476 was a political arrangement, not a civilization switched off like a lamp. That distinction matters because it keeps the story rich and real. The fall of the West was dramatic, but it was not an instant erasure of the Roman world. Instead, people carried Roman habits forward into a changed landscape, ruled by new powers. The emperor was gone, yet Roman life continued in altered form. That is one reason the end of Rome remains so captivating. History did not close the book. It turned the page, and the old world kept speaking through the next chapter. Odoacer ruled Italy while formally acknowledging the emperor in Constantinople. Odoacer did not present himself as the destroyer of Rome in some simple sense. He ruled Italy in a way that still nodded toward Roman legitimacy, and that is what makes his position so intriguing. After removing the Western emperor, he accepted authority in Italy, while recognizing the Eastern emperor in Constantinople as the senior imperial figure. This arrangement tells you a great deal about the age. Roman titles, Roman approval, and Roman continuity still mattered, even when the West no longer had its own emperor. Odoacer was strong enough to rule, but he understood that power worked better when draped in accepted forms. That made his kingship feel less like a clean break and more like a political improvisation inside the Roman tradition. Italy was being governed by a new kind of ruler, yet the language of empire still framed his authority. The Western throne had vanished, but Roman legitimacy remained too useful and too prestigious to discard. The Western throne vanished, but Roman law and memory endured. The disappearance of a Western emperor did not erase the legal habits and cultural memory that Rome had planted across centuries. Contracts still needed recognition. Property still needed definition. Communities still understood justice through concepts shaped by Roman rule. Even new rulers entering former imperial lands often found it wiser to govern through inherited legal frameworks than to invent entirely new ones. Memory mattered just as much. People remembered what Roman order had looked like, and those memories influenced what they expected from authority, status, and public life. This is one reason the fall of Rome feels so layered. A throne can vanish quickly, but the mental and legal world built by a great civilization fades much more slowly. Rome's state in the West collapsed, yet Rome's ways of organizing life continued to guide the post-imperial world. The empire lost its highest office, while its legal imagination and social memory continued shaping the lives of people who still lived among its ruins. Many so-called barbarian kings preserved Roman taxes, offices, and titles. One of the greatest surprises after the fall of the West is how much of Rome survived in the governments of its successors. Kings, often described as barbarian, did not simply sweep away every imperial structure. They kept tax systems where they could. They used Roman officials. They valued old titles and administrative forms because those tools helped them govern lands that had long been Roman. This makes the transition far more interesting than a story of destruction alone. New rulers inherited populations used to Roman habits and inherited territories whose roads, cities, and estates had been shaped by Roman administration. To rule effectively, they often had to borrow from what had come before. That did not make them Romans in the old sense, but it did make their kingdoms part of Rome's afterlife. The old empire had taught even its successors how power could be organized. In that way, Rome continued governing the West through men who had replaced its emperors, but retained many of its methods. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy through a kingdom that still looked Roman. When the Ostrogoths took control of Italy, the result was not a simple rejection of Roman civilization. Their kingdom, especially under Theodoric, preserved much of the outward shape of Roman governance. The Senate still mattered. Roman officials still served. Administration continued in familiar forms. Italians living under Ostrogothic rule could still recognize large parts of the political and social world around them, even though supreme power now rested with a Gothic king and his followers. That is what makes this period so mesmerizing. Italy became a place where conquest and continuity existed together. A new ruling people stood at the top, yet the machinery below often remained recognizably Roman. This was not an attempt to turn back time completely. It was something stranger and more subtle, which was the use of Roman forms inside a post-imperial kingdom. The Western Empire was gone, yet Italy still moved through a political landscape shaped deeply by Roman expectations, offices, and inherited habits. Theodoric governed as a barbarian king in a deeply Roman style. Theodoric the Great is one of the most remarkable figures of the post-Roman world because he managed to rule as both outsider and inheritor. He was an Ostrogothic king, backed by Gothic military power, yet he governed Italy with great respect for Roman administrative tradition and elite culture. He employed Roman statesmen such as Cassiodorus and Boethius. He maintained public works. He presented himself as a guardian of order rather than a destroyer of civilization. That combination gives him enormous historical fascination. He was not trying to recreate the old Western Empire exactly, but neither was he content to rule through brute force alone. He understood that Italy's prestige, wealth, and stability were bound up with Roman forms, so he used them. Under his rule, the post-Roman world looked less like a clean break and more like a hybrid creation, where Gothic kingship and Roman statecraft were woven together into something powerful, precarious, and distinctly Dibia, late antique. Latin survived the empire and slowly became the Romance languages. Empires can die while their language keeps traveling forward through ordinary mouths. That is exactly what happened with Latin in the West. Long after emperors vanished, people continued speaking local forms of Latin that had been shaped by region, accent, and daily use over many generations. These spoken varieties did not remain frozen. They changed, drifted apart, and eventually became the ancestors of languages such as Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. That is an extraordinary kind of survival. Rome's political unity disappeared, yet one of its deepest cultural legacies kept evolving inside the speech of farmers, merchants, priests, and families. The empire could no longer command the West, but it could still be heard in the words people used to pray, trade, argue, and tell stories. This makes the fall of Rome feel much less final than it first appears. The state ended, while its language remained alive enough to become the mother of whole new linguistic worlds. Roman roads, aqueducts, and walls outlived the state that built them. One of the most powerful things about Rome is that even after its Western government failed, its physical presence did not simply vanish. Roads still cut across landscapes that no emperor now commanded. Aqueducts still arched over valleys like stone reminders of vanished confidence. Walls still enclosed cities whose rulers had changed. That endurance matters because it shows how deeply Rome had reshaped the world. A traveler in the centuries after the fall could still move through Roman engineering and feel the ghost of imperial order underfoot. The state had weakened, but its infrastructure kept speaking. Sometimes those structures were maintained. Sometimes they were broken, reused, or stripped for stone. Yet even in decay, they remained astonishing. They told later peoples that something immense had once stood here and had organized land, water, defense, and movement on a grand scale. Rome's political body could die, while its bones stayed visible for generations, refusing to let memory disappear quietly. The Eastern Empire kept calling itself Roman long after the West fell. This is one of the most startling facts in the whole story, because it overturns the simple idea that Rome ended in the 5th century and was gone. In the East, the empire centered on Constantinople continued for centuries, and its people called themselves Romans with complete seriousness. They preserved imperial law, taxation, court ceremony, diplomacy, and a powerful sense of continuity with the ancient empire. Their language shifted increasingly toward Greek, and their culture changed over time, yet the Roman identity remained central. That is what makes the fall of the West feel less final than it first appears. Rome did not vanish everywhere. It survived in another half of its old world, still governing, still fighting wars, still imagining itself as the rightful empire. Later historians would call it Byzantine, but that was not the name its own people used. In their eyes, Rome still lived, and that claim carried extraordinary weight across the medieval centuries. Justinian later tried to rebuild the West and nearly broke the East. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian launched one of history's most audacious attempts at restoration. From Constantinople, he sent armies west to recover North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, as if the Roman world could still be stitched back together under imperial rule. For a moment, it almost worked. Victories against the Vandals and Ostrogoths made the dream of renewed empire feel possible again. Yet the cost was immense. War in Italy became prolonged and devastating. Resources were drained. Enemies pressed on other frontiers. The Eastern Empire stretched itself in pursuit of Western glory, and the burden proved dangerous. This is what makes Justinian so fascinating. He was both a restorer and a gambler, reaching backward toward Roman greatness while exposing his own state to exhaustion. His reign shows that Rome's legacy remained powerful enough to inspire massive reconquest, but also that the old Mediterranean empire had become too difficult to rebuild without threatening the strength of the state attempting it. Historians still argue whether Rome fell suddenly, slowly, or never fully. Few great historical events generate as much argument as the fall of Rome, and that ongoing debate is part of the fascination. Some historians emphasize dramatic moments such as sacks, battles, and the deposition of emperors. Others focus on long processes that stretched across centuries, where institutions weakened bit by bit until the end seemed almost impossible to date precisely. Still others argue that Rome did not truly disappear at all, because so much of its culture, law, language, and identity survived in changed forms. That disagreement is not a flaw in the story. It is one of its richest features. Rome was so vast and its ending so uneven that it resists a single neat conclusion. The date depends on what you mean by Rome. Do you mean the Western Emperor, the Roman state, the city, the culture, or the idea? Each answer gives a different ending. That is why the fall of Rome continues to feel alive in the hands of historians. Some see the fall as catastrophe, while others see transformation. The argument over Rome's end is not only about dates. It is also about what kind of event it truly was. For some, the fall was a catastrophe, a collapse of urban life, public order, literacy, security, and economic integration across much of the Western world. From that view, Rome's disappearance marked a profound loss. For others, the story looks more like transformation, where old imperial structures gave way to new kingdoms, new religious authority, and new cultural forms without total civilizational death. Both perspectives capture something real, which is why the debate continues. In some places, life became harsher and less connected. In others, continuity remained stronger than older dramatic narratives once allowed. That tension makes the subject far more compelling than a simple tale of doom. Rome's end could be ruin and reinvention at once, depending on where you look. The Western Empire fell, but what followed was not emptiness. It was a changed world, learning how to continue. Climate shifts and plague may have worsened Rome's already dangerous vulnerabilities. Rome did not weaken in a vacuum. Alongside political and military crises, the empire also faced environmental pressures that may have made existing problems far harder to manage. Climate variability could affect harvests, local stability, and the resilience of already stressed regions. Disease could cut into population, labor, military recruitment, and tax revenue. These forces do not explain the fall on their own, but they may have made a fragile system more brittle. That is what gives this subject such depth. The empire's troubles were not only created in palaces and on battlefields. Some came from forces no emperor could negotiate with and no general could defeat. The Roman world had long depended on dense connections of trade, movement, and administration. Those very strengths could also help strain a system when harvests failed or illness spread. Rome's fall becomes even more fascinating when you realize it may have been shaped partly by the natural world pressing against a civilization already living dangerously. Lead pipes did not destroy Rome, despite the famous old theory. For a long time, one of the most popular explanations for Rome's fall was also one of the most dramatic. The idea claimed that lead poisoning from Roman pipes, cookware, or wine vessels slowly damaged the health and judgment of the ruling class, helping bring the empire down from within. It is a striking theory, which helps explain why it spread so widely. Yet modern historians and scientists do not treat it as the main cause of Rome's collapse. Lead exposure certainly existed in the Roman world, but the empire's fall was far too complex to be reduced to poisoned plumbing. This matters because it shows how much people want a single clever answer to a vast historical mystery. Rome tempts us into searching for one hidden flaw that explains everything. The reality is more interesting and more human. The empire fell through overlapping crises, not a secret chemical curse running through its water system and quietly deciding its fate. Rome fell from many causes because no single explanation is enough. That is perhaps the truest sentence anyone can say about Rome's fall. No one cause can carry the full weight of the story. Invasions mattered, but so did civil wars. Economic strain mattered, but so did political instability. Migration mattered, but so did poor leadership, military transformation, and the shifting geography of power. Remove any one factor, and the story changes. Keep them together, and the Western Empire begins to look less like a victim of one blow and more like a structure weakened from many directions at once. That is why Rome remains so compelling. It resists simple answers. Human beings often want history to behave like a riddle with one elegant solution. Yet Rome teaches the opposite. Vast systems usually fail through accumulation, interaction, and bad timing. The empire's end was not one mistake. It was many pressures colliding inside a civilization that had once seemed too large, too rich, and too experienced ever to be brought down. The empire's end was messy, uneven, and different in every region. One reason Rome's fall is so hard to define is that it did not happen the same way everywhere. Britain slipped away through withdrawal and fading connection. Africa was seized with enormous strategic consequences. Italy remained symbolically central even as power changed hands. Gaul became a mosaic of Roman cities and new kingdoms. Spain passed through contested transitions of its own. This variety matters because it prevents the story from becoming too tidy. The Western Empire was one political structure, but its provinces lived through its ending in very different ways. Some regions saw sharper rupture. Some preserved stronger continuity. Some endured repeated war. Some adapted through local elites and church leadership. That unevenness makes the fall feel real. History rarely ends on a single cue. It breaks differently depending on place, pressure, and timing. Rome's Western collapse was one of the largest political transformations in history. Yet even that immense event arrived not as one clean ending, but as many regional endings unfolding together. Rome's fall remains unforgettable because its shadow still shapes our world. We still return to Rome because it continues to feel uncannily present. Our languages carry its influence. Our laws, political ideas, architecture, cities, calendars, and religious history all bear marks of the Roman world. Even the phrase, "the fall of Rome," has become a kind of shorthand for civilizational anxiety, a way of asking whether great powers can decay from within while still appearing strong from the outside. That enduring relevance is part of what makes the subject so mesmerizing. Rome is not just ancient history. It is a mirror people keep lifting toward later ages, hoping to see warning, wisdom, or reassurance in its reflection. The Western Empire fell long ago, yet the questions it raises remain startlingly alive. How does a superpower weaken? How do institutions outlast governments? What survives after political collapse? Rome's story still matters because its ending never stayed in the past. It keeps casting meaning forward into the world we live in now. And now our long journey through the fall of Rome begins to settle into stillness. Tonight we traced the slow unraveling of a world that once seemed too vast to fail. We wandered through imperial courts and frontier rivers, through crowded cities, distant provinces, and roads that stretched across continents. We watched emperors rise and vanish. We followed armies, migrations, betrayals, and shifting crowns. We saw Rome as power, as memory, as symbol, and as something far more human than a marble legend. Not a single collapse, but a long fading. Not one ending, but many. And yet, even as the empire fractured, so much endured. Language endured. Law endured. Faith endured. Roads, walls, and stories endured. The Roman world dimmed, but it did not vanish all at once. It lingered in stone, in custom, and in the minds of those who still lived among its remains. So now, let all of that begin to drift a little farther away. Let the cities grow quiet. Let the banners lower. Let the footsteps fade from the roads. Let the great halls empty, and the voices of emperors soften into distance. The weight of history can rest now. And if you are still awake, I invite you to continue on to the next journey waiting for you on screen. And if you have enjoyed traveling through the ancient world with me tonight, do leave a like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps this channel reach other wandering minds looking for rest, wonder, and a place to gently drift. But for now, simply breathe. Let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts loosen their grip. And let the last echoes of Rome fade softly into the night. Sleep well and good night.